Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kate, and I am the Distance Learning Specialist at the National World War II Museum here in New Orleans, Louisiana. We are going to begin our Meet the Author webinar with Mr. Neal Bascomb. As you can see, he is sitting next to me right now. But before we do that, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you to everyone who is tuned in and watching. And this is a live interactive broadcast. So on your screen, and this is more for the teachers, you should see something at the bottom that says Q&A. You can type in your questions to Neal, and we're going to ask him at the end your questions at any point though. So any point during the broadcast, you can type in a question you have for Mr. Bascomb, and we will get to many of them later. Also, if you have any technical difficulties, you can also type them in there. We will have someone trying to help you figure those out as well. But again, welcome, and thanks for being with us. Today, we are going to be talking about Mr. Bascomb's book, The Nazi Hunters, and awesome if your class has read it. But if you have not read it yet and you're interested, maybe asking it for a holiday or something, then at our museum store, you can receive a 20% discount using the code WEBINAR. And when we send out this broadcast after the program, because this is being recorded, we will include the information about purchasing this book from our museum store in there as well. So that kind of wraps up all of our housekeeping things, and I'm going to introduce our special guest today, and I'm going to turn it over to him. So this is Neal, and he is an author from many different books.
Many different books?
Many different books, but we are going to be talking about The Nazi Hunters, how a team, I love this title, of spies and survivors captured the world's most notorious Nazi. It's a thrilling spy mission for all you detectives out there. It is also a very moving Holocaust story, which ties in World War II, and of course a world-class work of narrative nonfiction. So thanks, Neal, for being with us here today.
Nice introduction.
And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Neal's going to talk about his book and being a writer. And then again, like I said, as he's talking, if you're thinking of questions, please type them in the Q&A, and we'll get to those in just a few moments. All right, Neal, it is all
me.
You.
Awesome. I love it. Well, hello, everybody in Webland, I guess. Let me just start by saying, as Kate introduced, I've written vastly different kinds of books. I've written about the effort to stop the Nazi atomic bomb. I've written about Roger Bannister breaking the 4-minute mile. My new book, which is coming out in next March, is about Grand Prix racing in the 1930s. And so it's this really broad, wide, kind of crazy range of different topics and titles. And people often ask me, why do I choose the books I choose? Is there any cohesive story there? And largely they're about, I would say, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, kind of doing the impossible. Those are the kind of stories that attract me. But when I come to a story like that, I ask myself kind of two key questions. The first question is, does this story have something important to say? And I think of all the books I've written, this story about the hunt of Adolf Eichmann, who was really the master operator of the Holocaust, has the most important story or theme to tell. And it's about the importance of justice, the importance of memory. And I came to this story actually in college. I was living in Luxembourg in Europe, this tiny little country in Luxembourg in Europe. And for extra money, I would walk dogs for various people in the surrounding neighborhood. And one of my clients was an elderly lady who had this little tiny little dog, and she was lovely and would invite me for tea afterwards generally. And one day she told me that she was a Holocaust survivor and that she really never talked about it or told her story or even told anyone about her experiences until Adolf Eichmann was captured, until the great trial that happened later back in Israel occurred, and all this testimony came forward about what happened to the Jews during World War II. And so that always sort of kept with me. And later, when I learned about the Mossad operation and how that all unfolded in capturing Adolf Eichmann in Argentina in 1960, I became utterly fascinated and decided this was a story I wanted to tell because, one, it's a great spy mission. It's a thriller, but also is an important story. It had lasting impact on history. If you were to have been in school in 1960, in middle school or high school or beyond, you largely would not have been taught the Holocaust. Teachers were not explaining it in school. There weren't this vast range of books on it. It was largely something that was kind of swept under the rug. And it wasn't until the capture of Eichmann that that changed. And so that's why I wrote this story. Now, the second question I asked myself is, do I have something new to tell? Now, there's been various books on this capture by, mostly before I wrote this book, mostly the people involved in it. The key one was Issa Harel, who was the head of the Mossad. And if you read all those, his story and other ones, they all say that everything went perfect, and that this spy operation in Argentina in 1960 was just boom, 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 and everything was perfect. There were no mistakes, and there was never a moment where it was going to go wrong. And that couldn't have been further from the truth when you actually investigate the history of this operation. So I thought that there was a lot of room for me as an historian, as a writer, as a storyteller, to tell the capture of Eichmann in an evocative way. So that's why. Now let me tell you first, I have this handy slideshow. I first tell you about Adolf Eichmann, I guess you would say the villain in this story. Now, Adolf Eichmann was only 26 years old in 1932 when he joined the SS, which were the security services of the Nazi Party, long before, not long before, but shortly before Hitler rose to power. Adolf Eichmann was an anti-Semite, but not in a way that he became, I guess you would say. His vehemence and his sort of dedication to destroying the Jewish people sort of grew and expanded over time, just as kind of the Nazi Party's dedication and commitment to destroying the Jews also grew and became more horrific. In the beginning, in the early 30s, mid 30s, it was about immigration. It was about seeing the Jewish population in Germany to essentially to immigrate them legally. That became, once 1937, 38 happened, became something much more about deportation, about forcing them out of the country. And then once as the war began, as Adolf Eichmann grew in power, it became something where ultimately the extermination of the Jewish people. Now, to give you an idea of who Adolf Eichmann was, in 1938, he was sent to Austria. The Germans had annexed or taken over Austria, and Adolf Eichmann was sent as the kind of the master of the Jews to go to Austria and to rid its Jewish population. He wrote a friend back in Germany, and the direct quote is, "They are finally in my hands. They are finally in my hands." Adolf Eichmann, as the war progressed, became kind of, as I said earlier, the master operator of the Holocaust. He was the one in charge of rounding up the Jewish populations in the various countries that Germany overtook, as well as in Germany itself, bringing the Jews together in camps, and then ultimately shipping them off to extermination camps like Auschwitz and elsewhere. In 1944, Adolf Eichmann was sent again as the master of the Jews to Hungary. Hungary had a population of roughly 725,000 Jews. Over the course of only months, he managed to eliminate roughly 450,000 of them. That was who Adolf Eichmann was. And in fact, as the war came to a close and his bosses were saying, we need to begin to use the remaining Jewish population as bargaining chips, Adolf Eichmann said, no, we need to continue to exterminate. He countermanded orders. He wanted to kill as many as possible. the war ends, and Adolf Eichmann knows very well that he's going to be pursued as a war criminal. He is captured a couple of times, actually, by the Americans, but they didn't know who he was. They managed to, and I'll move forward through the slide here. This is actually Adolf Eichmann in his sort of grandeur here. Adolf Eichmann was captured a couple times, escaped, moved to northern Germany, worked as a forest worker, felling trees. There was a manhunt for him even at this time. He ultimately made his way down in 1950 through Austria, down in Italy. He was helped by various members of the Catholic Church, not mandated by the Pope or anything, but various people who were sympathetic to the Nazis, and was given a new passport, a new ID, a new identity. And this is actually a photograph of the Red Cross passport that was issued to Adolf Eichmann, now known as Ricardo Clement, in the late 50s or early 1950, that he used ultimately to go to Argentina, a place where the head of the government thought that the Nazi war criminals or the Nazi war trials were what he called the worst atrocity of justice in history. He was a Nazi sympathizer, Juan Perón, and he wanted to bring in as many Nazis as possible, particularly people who were industrialists and security services, to help his burgeoning country. This is Adolf Eichmann, Ricardo Clement on the boat right before he leaves for Argentina. Shortly after he arrived, he went out to the countryside and worked with no experience at all in this, worked as an engineer in dam operations. He then moved to Argentina, or to Buenos Aires, the capital, and slowly became kind of a pariah in the community in Argentina, because he was constantly talking about the past. He was constantly reliving his power, what he had done. He once said at this time that he would happily jump into his grave knowing that 5 million Jews were following him there. That was who Adolf Eichmann was. Now, moving off of Adolf Eichmann, he's now in Argentina, in Buenos Aires. He's living by 1956, 57, working in the Mercedes-Benz plant there. He has his wife there. He has a newly born son. His 3 sons, who were born in Germany, come over to Argentina to join him. And he's living free and believes that no one will ever find him. The photograph here is a man named Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal would later become very famous as the first key chief Nazi hunter. But in 1945, he was a very different individual. He was stumbled out of a concentration camp. He was Jewish. He had been there for several years. He had lost a third of his body weight. He was barely alive. But he was determined to bring the Nazi war criminals to justice. And so he does kind of 4 key things related to Adolf Eichmann. The first is he proves that Adolf Eichmann did not die during the war. And Eichmann's family actually promoted that fact, that Adolf Eichmann was dead and that no one should find him. The second thing he did is he collected evidence about what Eichmann did over the course of the war, evidence that he hoped, Simon Wiesenthal hoped, would be used ultimately in a trial against him. The third thing he did was really in a kind of promotional way, he kind of kept this idea of the need to hunt for the war criminals of World War II alive. And the fourth, and probably the most important thing he did, was he found, with another individual, a photograph of what Eichmann looked like. Now, Eichmann made very sure over the course of the war that his portrait or his photograph was never taken. One of them was actually found. Simon Wiesenthal discovered that, and ultimately that was passed on to the people who ultimately captured him. This was another Nazi hunter who Wiesenthal collaborated with, Now this story goes, as I said in the very beginning, this is really a story about individual or ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and it's kind of a cliche, but I think for this story it's particularly apt, because as I said, by 1957, 1958, Adolf Eichmann is free and no one is looking for him. Let me introduce Sylvia Herman here on the left, and her father, Lothar Herman. Now, Sylvia was 17 years old, living in Buenos Aires, and she found herself dating a young man named Nicholas Eichmann. Now, the Eichmann name at this point in time was not really known. As I said in the very beginning, like the Holocaust and what happened was largely swept under the rug. So he was just a young, attractive-looking guy who she liked, and they were dating, and she, as many couples do, she invited him over for dinner at her parents' house. And over the course of dinner, Nicholas Eichmann says that it's, quote unquote, it's too bad the Germans didn't finish off the Jews during the war. Now, in Argentinian society at that time, which was tended to bend anti-Semitic, that would have maybe been an okay thing to say. But what Nicholas Eichmann did not know was that Sylvia Herman was half Jewish, and her father, Lothar Herman, who was blind, was blinded by the Jews, blinded by the Germans before he escaped to Argentina, and he had escaped there to basically survive the Holocaust. And so you can imagine how well that statement went over at the dinner table. Nothing was said. Because again, the Hermans were not living an open Jewish life, but the relationship between Sylvia and Nicholas Eichmann ended right then and there. So what happens is, a year later, Sylvia is reading the newspaper to her father, as she often did, because he was blind, and they come across this article about this man named Dr. Fritz Bauer, who was called as his photograph shows, kind of the bulldog of West German law. He was the Attorney General of the state of Hesse in West Germany. And at this time, he was really the only individual in Germany actively looking to bring the perpetrators of the Holocaust to justice. And so in that effort, he published a list of the top 10 war criminals that he wanted to go after and find. And one of those names was Adolf Eichmann. And so Sylvia is reading this newspaper to her father, and they come across the name Adolf Eichmann, and they pause and they hesitate for a moment. And they think to themselves, is it possible that Nicholas could be the son of Adolf Eichmann? Now, they know, of course, that many Germans came to Argentina after the war. They know that Nicholas never invited Sylvia to his house. They know that Nicholas said that his father was a high-ranking German officer who traveled around a lot during the war. And so they think, well, it's possible. It's possible that they could be the same person. So what ends up happening is Sylvia Herman sends this letter from Argentina across the oceans to West Germany. And in that letter, she states, I read your article. I think there's a possibility that Adolf Eichmann is living here in Buenos Aires. Now, this isn't the email that we have today that zip, 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 and it happens really quick and everything's done in 10 minutes. The letter takes a month to get there. Fritz Bauer receives it, and he has to decide what he's going to do. Now, he goes to Interpol, which is the sort of international police organization, and they want to have nothing to do with it. He goes to the Americans and says, I might have information on where Adolf Eichmann is. Are you interested in helping collaborate to help me in this effort? The Americans send him a note that says, quote unquote, we are not in the business of apprehending war criminals. Of course, he really can't go to the West German government overall, because half of the officials in the West German government at this point are former Nazi party officials. Again, there's no interest in dredging up the past, not only because those individuals don't want to be dredged up part of it, but overall people just want to put the war away and what happened. And so what Fritz Bauer does is sends a letter back to Sylvia Herman. And in that letter is the photograph of Adolf Eichmann that Simon Wiesenthal found, as well as a description of what he looked like, what he sounded like. And essentially, Fritz Bauer sends this note and says, okay, Sylvia, you're now 18. Okay, Lothar Herman, you're blind in your mid-40s. Why don't you go and see if it's actually Adolf Eichmann? Why don't you go and begin a detective or an investigation on the worst war criminal of the Holocaust? See if you can find him. Now, you can imagine being Sylvia and her father and being like, well, that's crazy. I'm not going to do that. And, I've sent the information. I'm done. What's remarkable is they do it. So they're now living outside of Buenos Aires, hundreds of miles outside of Buenos Aires, because they had moved to the deep countryside. And so they take an overnight train into Buenos Aires. And Sylvia begins asking around the neighborhood, do you know where Nicholas is? I'd love to talk to him. They ultimately begin and track down his address. And so one day, Sylvia Herman, as she later recounted, in a pretty dress, approaches the door of where Nicholas Eichmann was living. Her father, of course, is down the street, can be of no help. They have no backup. There's no backup. She knocks on the door, and who answers the door but a man named Ricardo Clement, Adolf Eichmann. And she says, I'm looking for Nicholas. And he says, well, Nicholas isn't here. Why don't you come inside? He'll be back shortly. And they begin to have a conversation. And Sylvia is thinking, it could be him. They kind of look similar, but she's not sure. If you look at what Adolf Eichmann, I'm going ahead of myself, what Adolf Eichmann looked like when you saw him giving his Sieg Heil salute in the beginning, and then what a photograph I'll show you at the end of this presentation, these are two very different men. Eichmann had, was now poor, living in Argentina, was obsessed about the past, was drinking a lot, was smoking a lot, and just had largely deteriorated as a human being. Not that he was very elevated to begin with. So he looked very different. So she's not sure. And she asks Ricardo Clement, what's your relationship with Nicholas? And he says, oh, I'm his uncle. He'll be back. Ultimately, Nicholas comes in the door. And you can imagine, like, your ex-girlfriend is now suddenly in your house, and your father is a war criminal, potentially being hunted, and you're confused. You've never given the address. And Nicholas, in a bit of a hurry, sort of kind of grabs Sylvia's arm and ushers her out of the house. And as he ushers Sylvia out of the house, he says, I'll be right back, father. And so Sylvia, being pretty bright, and Nicholas clearly not being terribly bright, Sylvia kind of knows now that Ricardo Clement is Adolf Eichmann. And so they leave, get to the father, they send another note. Again, months pass, Fritz Bauer gets this letter, and now feels like, okay, I have good evidence that this is Adolf Eichmann. He's living in Argentina. This is his assumed name. I know what house he's living in. Fantastic. But what's he going to do? He can't go to his government, as I said. He can't go to Interpol. He can't go to the United States. So what he ends up doing is taking and delivering news of Adolf Eichmann to the Mossad. The Mossad is the Mossad is the Israeli security services, kind of our version of the CIA. And the individual in charge of that at the time in the state of Israel is this man in these sporty sunglasses named Isser Harel. Now, Isser Harel is a very powerful individual in the newly formed state of Israel. He's not only head of the Mossad, he's also head of the Shin Bet. Shin Bet is the Israeli version of the FBI. So he is the head of the FBI and the head of the CIA in a sense. And largely his responsibility is securing the Israeli state from its neighbors, from its Arab neighbors. He, too, just like much of the Israeli state, is not really interested in looking into the past and pursuing war criminals. That is something to be set aside. But Isser Harel decides, well, I have to do something with this information. I can't just put it in a file. So, but he's going to do it the least he can. So he sends a police investigator, a man named Ephraim Hofstetter, who was very well-meaning and very good at his job in Israel, but spoke no Spanish, had never been to Argentina, knew nothing really about war criminals. And he's sent to Argentina to investigate whether or not this is really Adolf Eichmann living in this house in a neighborhood called Olivos outside of Buenos Aires. So Hofstetter goes there, he goes to the address, and he sees this house. This house is actually still there today. It's in this sort of dreary neighborhood. It's this tiny, like, brick, one, maybe two bedroom house, single story. And Ephraim Hofstetter looks at this house, and he just can't believe that Adolf Eichmann, this master operator, this high official in the Nazi party, could live, as he sent as a report back, such a wretched little house. And so the investigation is over. It ends. That's it. Now, a year passes. This is now 1959, late 1959. Dr. Fritz Bauer receives another bit of information, not from Sylvia or Lothar, but from a second source. Now, we know today that that source was from the West German security services or someone affiliated with them. But even at the time of writing Nazi Hunters, I didn't know. So history kind of evolves over time, and more information comes out, particularly about intelligence and spy stuff. And so there's elements of what happened that I wish I could slide here into the book, but we now know it's the West German intelligence services. It matches perfectly with what Sylvia and her father had found. It says it not only matches perfectly, but also gives information on exactly when Adolf Eichmann went to Argentina, the different names he had assumed, the different jobs he had held, and the different places he had lived. It was perfect. It was everything you needed to know to capture Eichmann. So Fritz Bauer, this time, instead of sort of quietly sending information to Israel, decides to get on a plane, memorizes all the information, goes to Israel, gets in a room with Isser Harel, and says, I have two sources saying exactly where he lives. You have to do something. It's been too long. He was in an absolute rage. He couldn't believe that Israel wouldn't do it. And he just was pounding the table. You have to find him. You have to find him. And so now Isser Harel has a situation. He now knows for sure that this individual who had perpetrated the Holocaust, we have identified him. We know where he's living. And something must be done. Now, what Isser Harel, head of the Shin Bet and Mossad, wants to do is, quite bluntly, he wants to kill him. He wants to either get him down a dark alley, arrange a car crash, but just kill him, get rid of him. It's easier that way. It's quicker, and that's what he believes Adolf Eichmann deserves. His boss, however, the head of the Israeli state, David Ben Gurion, has a different idea when he learns about the identity of where Eichmann is living. And what David Ben Gurion says is, we should capture him, we should bring him to Israel, and we should try him. We should have a worldwide publicized trial on what Eichmann did over the course of the war. And he gives two reasons why he wants to do it. And he states them to Isser Harel then, and he states it later when Eichmann is ultimately captured. The first thing he wants to do is he wants to remind the Israeli youth why the state of Israel needs to exist, because they want to avoid this ever happening to the Jewish people again. And the second thing is he wants to do with this trial of capture and the capture of Eichmann is he wants to remind and he wants to tell the world the story of the Holocaust. He wants people to know. He wants people to stop sweeping it under the rug. He wants this history and this memory to be alive in the world. So again, it never happens again. And he believes he can do that by capturing Adolf Eichmann. And so begins the operation to find him, or to capture him. And I say to find him because as all this time has passed, ultimately Adolf Eichmann, when this individual, Sylvia Herman, who was an investigator, was sent to Argentina to triple confirm that this is where he's living, discovers that Adolf Eichmann is no longer living in that Holocaust home. So not only do they have to capture him, detain Eichmann, and bring him back to Israel for justice, but the Mossad needs to find him again. And so begins, that's roughly a third of the book. So begins this, this mission by Aharoni, again, investigating, asking around the neighborhood where he lived, again, tracks down something that one of his sons had done, and ends up finding that Eichmann is living in this even more distant place on this house, on the house on Garibaldi Street. It's on Garibaldi. And Sylvia Herman begins to conduct surveillance on the house, and once again to prove, because you don't want to grab the wrong person. You don't want to grab someone, bring him back to Israel, and determine that actually that's not him. And so he has to determine within a shadow of the doubt that this is Adolf Eichmann. So this is the truck actually that he conducted surveillance in. He was in the back taking photographs, and an assistant was up driving it. One day he decides he needs to get very close to Eichmann. And so he has a suitcase with a camera embedded in it and a little clicker, almost like you see in the spy movies. And he goes up to the fence and begins talking to them. He spoke German, or he spoke Spanish quite well, and takes this photograph of Eichmann.
From his suitcase. From his suitcase.
So this is the actual photograph.
Wow.
And he took several others, it was on rapid fire. But they ultimately ended up being able to determine that this was Eichmann by his ears, of all things. Your ears are very similar to fingerprints. They're unique and distinct. They had photograph of Eichmann in the war, and they had this photograph, and they did studies on the shape of his face and the size of his ears, the curl of his ears, and everything, and determined definitively that this is Adolf Eichmann. And so begins the actual capture operation. And so the Mossad brings together this group of individuals from the Mossad and the Shin Bet, and they are everything that you would think about in this kind of spy operation. You had someone who was an expert in plannings and operation. You had a forger who could create passports and create license plates and any other identifications you would need. They had a couple strongmen who were placed on the team to grab Eichmann and physically bring him. Sylvia Herman, who was a master interrogator as well, was brought on the mission. And then you had Rafi Eitan, who was the head of the Mossad operation, and even Isser Harel himself went to Argentina to oversee this operation. You ultimately have the number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 top individuals in the Mossad on this operation. You can imagine that for the CIA today. That was how important this mission ultimately became. And so they survey this is the actual house. You see this little tiny house. Again, this master of the Jews now living in this tiny little concrete bunker in a distant area. This is Garibaldi Street here. That's a closer look of it. He wanted to be outside of the city. Again, A, because he couldn't afford it, and B, he was becoming very paranoid that he was being pursued. On May 11th, 1960, the Mossad operatives grab Eichmann, get him into the boot or the back seat of the car, and bring him to a safe house, and he's now captured. Now, I said that was very quick from a third of the book to the half of the book, but I won't tell you the whole story because, of course, I want you to read Nazi Hunters. But also because I want to have time to tell you sort of two key parts of this story that are thematic and also, I think, important to tell. The first is the idea of living with Adolf Eichmann. For 10 days, the Mossad had him in a safe house before they could get him out of the country. Now, when I was interviewing all these Mossad agents and the people involved in this operation, they largely spoke about these activities like they were going to the dry cleaning. They were devoid of emotion. It was just, I went here, I did this, I did that. And it was very matter of fact, except for this, whenever they talked about this 10-day period when they were living with him, bathing him, feeding him, watching him 24 hours a day, this individual who had perpetrated these heinous acts, and to a man, they became very emotional, and it was just heart-wrenching for them to remember. Not only in a positive way, they felt a great deal of pride of having this individual in their hands, captured, now going to serve justice, and that they had done it, this man who had caused so much death of their people, but also the horror of actually living with him and experiencing who he was, because he was, from the moment he was captured, totally compliant, would do whatever they said. He was just this sort of ratty individual, and they couldn't believe that this man had been responsible for so much death. This is actually the mask that covered his face as he was being transported to the safe house. Now, the second part I want to tell you, and this is really about sacrifice and the willingness for these ordinary people to do to bring Eichmann to justice. They need to get him out of the country, right? They can't really walk him back to Israel. That's not going to be possible. They have a plan to bring him by boat if things go wrong. But again, by boat, it's a long way to Israel, many weeks. And at any point in time, word can get out that Eichmann has been captured, and various countries can maybe stop that ship from reaching Israel. So they need to fly him back. They need to bring him by plane. And so they decide that they're going to have this, they're going to send a delegation from Israel to Argentina to celebrate the 150th anniversary of Argentinian independence from Spain. It's a mouthful. Not that the Israelis give a hoot about Argentinian independence, but it's the perfect cover to send this El Al plane, which doesn't service Buenos Aires, to fly specially to Buenos Aires. So this plane arrives, and now everything goes pretty well. They get Eichmann, they drug him, they have a new ID. He's sort of sleepy as they get him onto the plane. He's in the back of the plane, and back in this time, first class was in the back. So he's now in the back of the plane being guarded. And the plane with the pilots from El Al, who were told only 24 hours beforehand that they were not there to have a great trip to Argentina and to dance the tango and eat big steaks, but they were actually there to bring Adolf Eichmann, this war criminal, home. And to an individual, they were scared. I interviewed pretty much most of them, this El Al staff, stewards, navigators, pilots, mechanical crews. Can you imagine? I mean, these ordinary people, and now they're involved in this spy operation. But everything goes well. They get them on the plane. They begin taxiing to the runway. They're ready to take off, and they're told, stop. Air traffic control says you can't take off. And there's an extraordinary conversation between Zvi Tohar, who's the pilot of the plane, and had participated in the Israeli war as a pilot, and was a pretty cool-headed guy, and Isser Harel. Isser Harel is also a pretty cool-headed guy. Had a plan for a backup plan, a backup plan for a backup plan for a backup plan, but he never imagined that they would have Eichmann. They would be ready to take off, and suddenly they would be said, nope, you can't go. And so he's panicked, and he says, let's just go. Let's take off. And Zvi Tohar says, as Isser Harel said, let's test the prowess of the Argentinian Air Force. And Zvi Tohar says, I think we should maybe slow down a little bit. Let's see what they want. And probably one of my favorite people I interviewed in the course of this story was the navigator, this individual named Shaul. Shaul is about 6'5". He's a huge man. He, lovely guy. But imagine him in this cockpit, and they're small now, but they were even smaller then. He's sort of hunched over in this cockpit. And he says, I'll go see what they want. I'll go check out why they're stopping us. And Israel turns to him and says, well, Shaul, that's lovely. You want to do that. This isn't a direct quote, but I'm paraphrasing. But listen, if you go and things go wrong, we're going to leave you here. We will take off and we will leave you, quote unquote, holding the bag for what's happened here. And Shaul says, I will go. And he told me as he was stepping down, you see the steps here in this photograph, as he was coming down those steps, he remembers his heart sort of sinking into his shoes and how scared he was. But he thought that he had to do it. He had lost family in the Holocaust, much as most of these people involved in this operation had. And he thought it was his responsibility. It was a sacrifice he was willing to take for justice, to bring Eichmann home. And so he did, and they learned that it was nothing. It was all about a wrong signature here or something there, and that's why they couldn't take off. But if Shaul wouldn't have gone, they would have had to diverted the flight to try to evade the Argentinian Air Force, if that's what it came to. They had very little fuel. They were flying all the way to Dakar, Senegal, so that they would not be stopped. When they arrived in Dakar, at that time, they were almost out of gas. The lights were going crazy. They ran out of gas as they were taxiing on the runway. So if Shaul hadn't gone, that plane never would have arrived. It would have very likely gone down at sea. And it was sacrifices like Shaul made, risks that Shaul and all these agents and various LL people made over the course of this mission that brought Eichmann ultimately to Israel, to justice. This is Zvi Tohar, the pilot, looks very cheery looking guy. Ultimately, again, wrapping up, Eichmann was tried by the Israeli state. He was found guilty of multiple crimes. The trial itself was broadcast. This is a famous photograph of Eichmann in the glass booth. They put him in this glass booth because they were afraid that he would be assassinated. And you see he's so well guarded. And ultimately he was found guilty. He was tried. He was sentenced to death. His body was cremated. His ashes were spread at sea so that there would be no memorial for the site of Adolf Eichmann. The most important part of this trial was the publicity and the scale of worldwide attention that it received. You couldn't read a newspaper at the time. You couldn't listen to the radio. You couldn't watch burgeoning television without seeing the trial and people being told the story of the Holocaust and what happened. And it would not have happened without these ordinary people doing these extraordinary things. And that's the story of Nazi hunters. So I think I'm out of slides. That must be the end. This is a terrible photograph of, again, just the kind of, the operation I just learned from the great exhibit here at the World War II Museum. The operation was codenamed Dybbuk, which was, the translation is basically a demon that inhabits a human body. He very much looks like a demon here. And that's the story of Nazi hunters. I'd love to answer some questions if there are some.
Awesome. Yes, we have a ton of questions, and I appreciate that you didn't give it all away. I've read the book a few times, so there's still lots of stuff in the book. And so we are also, while we're pulling up questions, Mr. Bascomb talked about the fact that we do have the Eichmann exhibit, Operation Finale, at our museum right now. And so this is a photograph of, we're actually right downstairs, right below us, of the booth that you saw in his presentation. We have that here along with most of the footage of the actual trial along with many micro, or what we call small artifacts, like the actual falsified passport that you see here of Adolf Eichmann. They took this photograph when he was in that safe house. And also some of the things that he had on him. So here you see a comb and a pocket knife and a cigarette holder. I actually didn't know what that was. But that was what Eichmann was carrying. And so this exhibit, that is not our exhibit, it's on loan from us. This one I thought was really, really cool.
It's tremendous, this exhibit. So not everyone can get to New Orleans, but if you can, it's worth seeing.
But this is the original suitcase containing a kit for preparing license plates. So those fake papers and those fake documents and licenses, we have all of that here in our exhibit. So, you know, it's one thing to learn about history. It's another thing to see it right in front of you.
Absolutely.
And so I'm going to start with a few questions, and we have a lot so thank you, and keep sending them in. And you kind of already touched on this a little bit, but Miss Doolin's class wants to know, how many of the people involved did you get to interview personally?
So that's a great question. I originally, when I went to Israel to interview people, they said, well, we're not going to give you any people to talk to. Essentially, they sort of shut me down. And it took sort of months of convincing for Rafi Eitan, who was, again, the sort of head of this operation, short of Israel, to meet with me. And they were a little worried, because I'm not Jewish, that I would have some sort of strange bent on what happened. But I got in a room with Rafi and told him what I was doing and why I was writing it. And ultimately, they sort of opened the doors for me. So I ended up interviewing Rafi. I interviewed the number 2 guy, Abraham Shalom, Yaakov Gat, and several others. And then several others had passed away, so that was not going to happen. But the Israeli state and some documentarians had actually collected a bunch of one-on-one interviews with these individuals that had not been publicized. And so I had access to all of those interviews. And then as I was there, the Israeli state finally allowed El Al. These people on El Al, the navigators, Shaul, the stewards, they had never been allowed to talk about this to anybody. And it wasn't because I was so charming and convincing, unfortunately, but they decided that enough time had passed and that they would allow them to be interviewed. And so I was one of the first, if not the first person to interview Shaul and the El Al people who on the ground who orchestrated this and everyone. So it was absolutely fascinating. And as a writer of history, it's so important to actually speak to the people involved if you have that opportunity, because you get the emotions, as I was saying about the Mossad agents, and you can get beyond just the facts. And that's what sort of brings these stories alive.
So sometimes part of being a writer is being a detective yourself.
Absolutely. I mean, it's part of that. I mean, I love to physically write. Well, not physically, but I like the process of writing. But doing these books is, there's 2 parts. There's the investigation, the detective work. Sometimes it's just spending time in libraries, but other times it's tracking people down. Tracking families and individuals and getting them to talk to you and interviewing them. And that to me is just as interesting and just as fun and taps a different kind of brain part than sitting down and staring at an empty page and the horror of that. It's maybe some of and beginning to actually craft a book.
Awesome. And you mentioned families, and when you were talking about your presentation, you mentioned that Lothar Ehrman was a Dachau survivor, a survivor of one of the camps. But Michelle Horvath wants to know, were there any other Holocaust survivors who were part of the capture? So
a few of the El Al people as younger children had escaped Europe and come, but I'm trying to sort of track down in my memory whether any of them were actual survivors of camps. I can't determine that 100%, but I know that, for instance, Peter Malkin, Zvi Malkin, who was one of the guys who actually grabbed Eichmann, and actually the museum has the mold of his gloves,
His gloves,
as you
yes.
know, which is pretty haunting. He had lost his sister in the Holocaust. He had, barely escaped. They all had family. Again, as I said, they had lost family. So this was very personal. It wasn't just about the security of the Israeli state. It was a very personal mission.
And keeping on that theme of family, but now going to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, Michelle also wants to know, did Eichmann's family, because he had a wife and 3 sons?
A wife and 4 sons.
4 sons. Attend the trial or even comment on his arrest?
I mean, the family, what happened in the family is pretty fascinating. I'll tell you kind of maybe one part of that. When it was ultimately discovered, and Ben Gurion said that Israeli state security services had captured Eichmann, he was now back in Israel. And Vera Eichmann, his wife, went to the Argentinian government and also to the United Nations and basically tried to sue the Israeli state to have her husband return to Argentina. And in fact, it was that lawsuit where I ended up finding that passport he used. It was in the files that had never been seen before. And it ultimately was unsuccessful, but it caused this sort of international brouhaha. And the United Nations ended up, kind of censoring Israel for committing this kidnapping on in another country's land.
Right.
So it wasn't great. But the family during the trial was not in attendance at the trial. But Eichmann was able to sort of correspond with them. The family then has gone on. One of the sons was born there and is now a professor in Germany, and sort of looks back at what his father did and barely knew him, and says what a horrible, awful man he was. But 3 of the sons, one is a neo-Nazi living underground in Argentina. 2 live on the Swiss-German border. I tried to speak to them. They do not say that their father did anything wrong, that he's a hero. So it's pretty awful.
Yeah, so the theme of family comes up a lot in
absolutely.
This book, more than I anticipated when I read it. And you don't have to answer this, but Miss Doolin's class also wants to know, was there anything you learned that you did not include in the book?
Anything that I learned that I did not include in the book? That is a very good question. I wrote this book a little while ago, so I'm trying to think. There was nothing that I felt compelled to omit for intelligence reasons. I will say that. There was nothing that the Israeli state said, well, we've given you this information, but you can't publicize this. They're pretty careful about what they release, and so if they release something, they're not going to backtrack on it. But again, when I research these books, there's just such a vast amount of material, and part of the art or of crafting these books is deciding what to omit. So this book is probably a fifth of the amount of information that I had. But I needed to tell what I hope readers find a pretty sort of fast, thrilling story.
Awesome. Yeah, like I said, if you haven't read it,
you
definitely should. And so you may not know this exact number, but Jill Spring wants to know about how many people that were involved, because this did happen a while ago, are still alive. Is anybody, do you know, that is still alive today in 2019?
The Rafi Eitan passed away recently. Abraham Shalom passed away recently. I think most of the Mossad agents have passed. I do know that a number of the El Al people are still alive. They were a little bit younger than most of them. Shaul is still alive, and many of them have read the book, and which is kind of a nice thing as an author to write about somebody and to share the book. And for the most part, they thought I got it right. So
Awesome. So when I was reading the book, the trial really, because there's something really interesting about the trial. Wasn't it the first ever televised trial?
Yes, I mean, the trial was sort of groundbreaking in so many ways. Just the international attention, the televised version of it, the radio, as I said earlier, the amount of newsprint that it got. And ultimately, the trial really wasn't about Adolf Eichmann. I mean, he was the one in the glass booth, right? And he was the name that was repeated. But they indicted him on so many counts, on so many aspects. They basically indicted the Holocaust in the trial. The trial was a trial against Germany and their participation in the Holocaust. So you had one survivor after the next who had experienced some of these things testifying at the trial. Most every aspect of the Holocaust was brought in so that the world could be exposed to all the horror of it. And Eichmann was, in essence, a stand-in for all of that. Not to say that he was wrongly convicted. I mean, he perpetrated a lot of terribly heinous acts and really was the operational master of the Holocaust. But this was a trial against the Holocaust, and it was very effective. And those two things that I said that Ben Gurion wanted to do, remind Israeli youth and tell the world, both of those things were achieved, and it was an absolute genius, effect.
And you talk a little bit about in your epilogue about that, and we'll kind of end this with a quote from your epilogue. But I have one more question.
I like quotes.
From a student in Miss Horvath's class. And did anyone speak out in defense of Eichmann during the trial?
No. I mean, there was no sort of testifying witnesses saying, he wasn't involved or he was doing right. I mean, Eichmann himself had a very sort of, his basic defense is that I was following orders and that I was just a sort of cog in the wheel of the Nazi state. But the evidence showed time and again that was not the case. I mean, Eichmann put up a pretty robust defense for himself, and he had lawyers and talked about what his role was, and again about following orders. But the judges saw through that, and I think the world saw through that.
Awesome. So we're going to end. I have the book here, and if you have the book, it's going to be on your screen, pages 212 to 13, talking a little bit about the legacy of this trial, and where we'll end it with that. So if you wouldn't mind reading
the highlighted
bits.
I'm very sharp. The trial educated the Israeli public, particularly the young, about the true nature of the Holocaust. And after 16 years of silence, it allowed survivors to openly share their experiences. In the rest of the world, the intense media coverage and the wave of Eichmann biographies and fantastic accounts of his capture rooted the Holocaust in the collective cultural consciousness. Yeah, I forgot I wrote that.
So that really spoke to me when I read the book, in terms of, in 2019, I spent the summer learning at Yad Vashem in Israel, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Center, and here, at the World War II Museum, we were teaching about the Holocaust. But I sometimes wonder, without this trial of Eichmann, how much of it would be talking about today, because it really opened it up.
It opened it up, and if you look at if you just go to a library bookshelf and see the amount of books that were written about the Holocaust prior to 1960, and the vast realms of books written about the Holocaust and survivor accounts, all of which are very important. I mean, the discrepancy is
huge.
Yeah, that's a few, and then there's
it really opened the doors.
So it's had its effect, and it allowed, I think, most importantly, survivors to talk about it. And I think the survivors' willingness to talk about it and openness to talk about it has had a profound effect on our understanding of the Holocaust and our sort of conviction that that kind of thing won't happen again.
Awesome. Well, we really appreciate
Thank you
coming to talk to us.
Thank you, everybody.
Everybody out there, we thank you for your questions and your time. And if you're interested, we are doing a webinar next month about the 78th anniversary of Pearl Harbor. But we are going to end it here, and we hope that you have a great rest of your Tuesday. Thanks for joining us at the National World War II Museum with Mr. Neal Bascomb.
Thank you.